So, in a previous video, you've seen an example of a bad grammar lesson. This bad grammar lesson was about past perfect, and you can see the slides here. So the first slide has the large title, Past Perfect, and a kind of explicit grammar explanation. The second slide has a task where students transform some sentences, and the final slide is Hangman Game. So that's an example of a bad grammar lesson. So in this video, we're going to look at how to make a better lesson to teach and practice past perfect. So this video is going to include some lessons, past perfect example lessons. All of these lessons introduce and practice the past perfect with a focus on context and student-centered practice. So these lessons, there's 3 example lessons here with a focus on context of use and practice. Okay, so first lesson is going to be focused on daily schedule. Lesson 2 has more of a focus on travel and weekly schedule. And then lesson 3 is kind of lifetime, your lifetime. So we're going to make a life timeline. Okay, so these 3 example lessons are all focused on past perfect, but they include more examples, more modeling, more scaffolding, and also more opportunities for students to practice and personalize the language that we're teaching here. Okay, these lessons could be combined. We could kind of organize these lessons together in some way, or they could be separate lessons, like of a week schedule, or as a review activity for practicing the language again in a future class. Okay, so let's start on these 3 lessons. Now, this is lesson 1, and I start by showing my daily schedule. So here's my daily schedule. At 8 a.m. I had breakfast, 8:30 a.m. drunk coffee, 9 a.m. took the subway, 9:30 a.m. arrived at work and drunk coffee, 10 a.m. started class. Okay, now notice I've actually used the past participle, the correct verbs here, drunk, okay, just to make it a little bit easier for the students. Now, I've put some examples at the bottom because when you're teaching, it's really important to include your examples at the beginning so students can kind of see the language that you're trying to focus on. So here are my sentences. I had already had breakfast by the time I took the subway. Is that right? So 8 a.m. had breakfast, 9 a.m. took the subway. So that's right. I had already drunk 2 cups of coffee before I started class. Okay, so when did I have coffee? I had coffee at 8:30 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. and then 10 a.m. started class. So I had already drunk 2 cups of coffee before I started class. Okay, so of course, as you notice, these 2 sentences are past perfect, but notice this slide doesn't talk about past perfect at all, okay? You don't need to be explicit to the students what grammar you're teaching, okay? It's more important to give examples and for them to understand the meaning and the context. You don't have to explicitly tell them what the grammar point is. Okay, let's move on. So we're going to stay with daily schedule now. Now we have Peter's schedule and Amy's schedule. Okay, and we've got a few things on their schedule. So you could give a few minutes for students to read about their schedules. And again, we've got some examples at the bottom here. Okay, so number 1, Peter had already been for a run before Amy ate breakfast. Okay, so have a look at the schedule. 7 a.m. Peter went for a run. 8 a.m. Amy had breakfast. So that's right. Peter had already been for a run before Amy ate breakfast. Number 2. Amy had already eaten breakfast by the time Peter ate breakfast. Okay, so you can see number 2 with the arrow, and you can see that one action happened before the other. Okay, so there's a few examples and there's some daily schedules for the students to look at, and at this point in the lesson I would ask students to make some new sentences. Give them some time. If they're lower level students, you might ask them to write the sentences first. If they're a little bit higher level students, you could ask them to work with a partner just to make sentences and share sentences with each other. Okay, yeah, because higher level students need less preparation time. For lower level students, give more preparation time ask them to write the sentences so they can really think about the structure of what they're writing and get it correct. Okay, so there's a little bit of practice for the students to start formulating sentences, but again, we've got a context and we've got examples. That's really important. Okay, so now this is the next task. We've done the modeling, we've set the context, and now we're moving towards student production. So in this task, students are going to make their own daily schedule. You can see here a blank worksheet that has lots of times, and we give this to the students, and here is the task. Complete the daily schedule with your schedule from yesterday. It should be approximately true, so it should be mostly true, but you can kind of, add some extra details if you want. Then you're going to compare it with your partner. Okay, so you might give some time first for them to write their schedule and put some things that they did into the daily schedule. Okay, now if they, something I could actually add to this is some support for the kind of verbs that they might need. Okay, so if they need help with transforming any of the verbs, if they're very low level students, you might include a step before this to help them. Okay, you can also go around and check their schedules. Okay, so here are some examples. Again, giving examples before students practice is really important. By 11 a.m., I had already drunk 2 cups of coffee. I had already eaten breakfast by the time you woke up. Okay, so we're going to do some comparing when students have finished. When you went to work, I hadn't eaten breakfast yet. Okay, so there's an example, and put students into pairs, and they have to make some sentence comparing their schedule with their partner's daily schedule. Now, like I mentioned, you might need to adapt this for different types of students. They might need a little bit more support. They might need more examples if they're very low-level students. If they're higher-level students, you can probably move more quickly into this activity. Okay, so there's the student practice. Okay, this is lesson 2. Okay, now this is different. We're going to start by focusing on the timeline of past perfect. This is a little bit more explicit about the grammar that we're learning. So I just want to give you different examples. Sometimes you can share the grammar point. Other times you might not want to tell the students and just provide examples. So here's a timeline. Have a look at the sentence. When she arrived at the party, Paul had already left. Okay, now a timeline when we're dealing with tenses is quite a useful thing to present. Some students like to see this information visually, and it helps them to understand different aspects of tense like progressive and past tense, future tense, and so on. Okay, so on the timeline, the black arrow, you can see first, the first action is Paul, and the second action is Sarah. Okay, and you can see the present and the future. So both actions happened in the past, but one action happened before the other action. So when she arrived at the party is Sarah. That happened in the past. But an action before that is Paul had already left. So it's 2 actions in the past. Therefore, the past perfect is the past of the past. Something that happened before, something that happened in the past. Okay. Now, we've got a little bit more about timelines here because timelines are quite useful for tenses. So you can see this blue arrow going from the past to now. Okay, now is actually beyond the red triangle at the end of the arrow. Okay, so the first example, after Sophie had finished her work, she went for lunch. Okay, so Sophie went for lunch happened in the past, and before that, Sophie had finished her work. So both of these actions are in the past. The first action, Sophie finished her work and then she went for lunch. The second example, I cleaned my room after the TV show had finished. Okay, so let's try and put these on the timeline. First, something had finished. The TV show had finished. Then, the second action, I cleaned my room. Okay, notice how going down the slide, at the beginning, we've got the full example sentences in red. The second one gives you some hints, and the final three just have question marks, okay? So this is a way that you can organize your design of your slides or your worksheet to kind of scaffold support at the beginning and then take away that support later on. So the third example here, I hadn't eaten at that restaurant before yesterday. Okay, so what is the first action, the first red star? Okay, the first red star, I hadn't eaten at that restaurant. The second red star, yesterday. Okay. The next example, Mary went to John's house, but he had already left to work. So, what is the first action, the first red star? He had already left to work is the first red star. And the second red star, Mary went to John's house. Okay, and the final example at the bottom, we had waited for 2 hours before the doctor came. Okay, so what is the first red star on the timeline? We had waited for 2 hours. And the second red star, the doctor came. Okay, so these timeline examples give some students some practice with analyzing sentences and deciding what was the first action and the second action on the timeline. Okay, now here's a checking stage. Checking is really important. So I suggest you include checking in your lessons. Now, what this is checking is actually what is the difference between past perfect and simple past. So in simple past, there aren't two actions that happened in the past. Simple past is just one action that happened in the past. The reason why we use past perfect is because two actions happened in the past, and we're telling you which action happened before the other action. Okay, so have a look at these examples. The first one, she never saw a bear before she moved to Alaska. She had never seen a bear before she moved to Alaska. Okay, so which of these two sentences is correct? Well, the first sentence has simple past. But there are two actions, aren't there, in these examples? Saw a bear or never saw a bear, and moved to Alaska. So here, the second one is correct. We should use past perfect if there are two actions. Now look at the example with King Sejong. Okay, King Sejong had invented Hangul. King Sejong invented Hangul. Which of these is correct? Okay, well, how many actions happened? There was only one action, okay, in these examples. King Sejong invented Hangul. So we shouldn't use the past perfect here because there isn't another action in these sentences. So in the second one, we should use the simple past. King Sejong invented Hangul. We don't need to use past perfect in this example. Okay, so it's a good idea to check. And sometimes you may want to, if you're teaching a grammar point, you may want to compare it with another grammar point, because knowing what grammar is, but also knowing what it isn't, or what is kind of the opposite example, can help students to understand what is and what isn't the meaning or use of some language. Okay, so the reason for this slide is to check students understand why we use past perfect instead of simple past. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so we're going to use this idea of timelines in this lesson, but now we're going to apply that idea to a subway line. Now, this is actually a really great idea. I borrowed this from one of my students, and one of my students did a lesson about timelines on a subway line. Okay, or it could have been one of my suggestions. I can't remember now. Okay, but yeah, so we can apply this idea of a timeline to a subway map. So we're going to help these two travelers, Jack and Amy. They are traveling in Seoul. They start at Hapjeong Station. When they got to Sinchon, they had already eaten breakfast in Hongdae. Okay, They start at Hapjeong, and they are going to on the subway. What do they do at Hongik Station or Hongdae? They eat breakfast. And then the second action, they get to Sinchon. So when they got to Sinchon, they had already eaten breakfast in Hongdae. So we're going to continue using this idea of timelines on a subway map. Okay, here are some more examples. It's really important to give lots of examples. They had already drunk coffee in Sinchon when they arrived at Ewa. By the time they got to City Hall, they had already bought souvenirs at Ewa. They'd seen Namsan Gate already when they went shopping in Dongdaemun. Okay, so this is all using this subway line, line 2 in Seoul, and we're finding out about what they did during the day, the different actions they did during the day. Now, here is my subway, and here is some information about me. I start at Hanguk University. By the time I got to Hwegi, I had already had coffee near Hanguk University. When I got to Dongdaemun, I had already eaten pajeon at Dongmyo. Okay, so this is my day and the different things I did during my day. So here is the task for the students. Choose any subway map that you know and write 3 or 4 sentences about things that you did during the day. So imagine you had a day out on your subway line and you made various stops on the subway line. And I want you to explain the things that you did at those various stops, okay? So give some student time, give them preparation time to write these sentences. Again, you can give some example verbs to help them. And, you know, for low-level students, this thinking time, this processing time is really important. It gives you a chance to help the students as well, any students that are having difficulties or questions. Okay, at the end of this, the students share their sentences with their partners. And then at the end of the class, maybe you ask students to share a few things with the whole class. Okay. Right, now, so that was lesson 2. Now let's move on to lesson 3. This one is more about our life, okay? So we've seen examples of traveling and daily schedule. Now we're going to apply this grammar point to our life. Okay, how things have changed is the title of this lesson. Okay, so on this slide you can actually see a picture of me. This picture is from 2006 when I first came to Korea. I look very young, and this was my first example of teaching at an academy in Korea. Okay, so we're going to talk about our lives, and we're going to share things about our lives in this lesson. Just a little tip, it is nice to share things about yourself, okay? So when you're teaching and you're giving examples, give examples from your life. It kind of makes the classroom atmosphere a bit warmer, and it's a nice way of getting their students' interest, and also it gives you a chance to model and give examples. So here are some examples about me. In the last 12 years, I have taught students of all ages. I have visited 5 countries in Asia, and I have had 2 children. Okay, so here's a little warm-up task. Make a list of 3 things you have achieved in the last 5 years and share with your partner. Okay, so a list of 3 things, kind of amazing things you've done or places you've been, and so on. Okay, so that's a nice little warm-up task just to get started on this lesson. Okay, now here's another kind of nice type of activity. You give some examples and ask students to guess which ones are true or to find the mistakes or something like that. So guess the truth. Guess which is true and which is false. These are 3 sentences about me. Okay, number 1. When I came to Korea in 2006, I hadn't eaten kimchi yet. Number 2. When I was 25 years old, I had never been to Asia. And number 3. Before I started working at HUFS, Hanguk University of Foreign Studies, I had never taught teachers before. Okay, so these are 3 sentences about me. You can give the students a few minutes to look at them, think, maybe discuss together. Now notice these sentences are past perfect sentences, and again, I haven't been explicit in this lesson about what we're learning. We're just focusing on examples and context of use, because you can teach grammar without explicitly explaining the grammar point. Okay, so students are going to read the sentences, discuss with their partner, and guess which ones are true. Okay, so number one, is it true or false? Okay, this one is actually true. Okay, so I had never eaten kimchi before I came to Korea is true. Okay, so the first time I had kimchi was when I came to Korea. Okay, number two. When I was 25 years old, I had never been to Asia. What do you think? Is this true? Okay, actually, this is true. Yes. So when I was young, I traveled a lot. I traveled in Asia and Africa and North America. I've visited most of the countries in North Africa and quite a few countries in Europe. But when I was 25, I had never been to Asia. So that's true. Okay, number three. Before I started working at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies, I had never taught teachers before. Okay, is that true or false? Okay, well that's actually false, because before I was a teacher at this university, Hanguk University, I had taught teachers at Seoul National University of Education. So this one is actually false. Okay, so that's a little warm-up. I've given some examples. I've modeled the activity, which is really important. Now, your turn. So what I want you to do is write 3 sentences using had plus already or never. Some should be true and some false. Okay, so I'm going to give some preparation time. Write 3 sentences, and some are true, some are false. Okay, so students do this. You can give some support, give some help, suggestions, and then at the end they get into groups. They read their 3 sentences, and the group has to guess if the sentences are true or false. Okay, so that's a nice little task. That's a good way of organizing an activity with the examples and the teacher demonstrating the task at the beginning and then the students doing the task. Okay, now we're going to talk about life timeline. And before we prepare the life timeline, let's have a look at this. So, here is a timeline with 3 points on the timeline. In the middle, I started teaching this course at Hufs in 2016. Okay, and so before 2016, I had already taught at a kindergarten, but I hadn't been to China yet. Okay, so I went to China in the future, for example, but I hadn't been to China yet. When I started this course in 2016, I hadn't been to China yet. Okay, so that's an action that happened in the future. Okay, so I've got the example sentences here, and you can give some extra examples, but this is just to draw their attention to already and yet. Okay, you can also ask students to prepare some examples as well. Okay, but this is the main task now for this lesson. We're going to make a life timeline. So here is my life timeline. Starts when I was born in 1979 in Burnley in England. I moved out of home when I was 18 years old. I lived in Barcelona when I was 25. I came to Korea in 2006. I completed an MA TESOL in England in 2010, and I started teaching at Hufs in 2013. So here are 6 points on my timeline. So what I want you to do is make a timeline with around about 6 dates from your life. Okay, so give some time for students to do that. And you can see my example sentences at the bottom here. When I came to Korea, I had already lived in Barcelona. When I started teaching at Hufs, I had already completed an MA TESOL. Okay, So these example sentences are talking about 2 points in the past and using past perfect. So using the timeline, you can ask students to share information about their life using the past perfect examples. Okay, so that's a timeline task. That is the main communicative task, and it's very much focused on the students' lives, personalizing the language and practicing the language in a meaningful way that really communicates things about themselves. Okay, so that's the main speaking activity for the third lesson. Now, I just want to add at the end here that you could include extra materials such as worksheets. So here's an example of a worksheet that compares past perfect, present perfect, and simple past. So depending on the types of students you have, how much support they need, how much time you have as well, you could also include worksheets and extra practice in those example lessons. Okay, so that was an example of some lessons for practicing past perfect. Notice that they were more meaningful, they were more focused on students' practice, and they had more kind of context to give the language meaningful context in the practice. Okay, so I hope that was interesting and useful and it gave you some ideas about teaching. Thank you very much.